Thank you so much for being here today. Before I start talking about some economics, I wanted to thank Governor Costa and members of the board for supporting this event and bringing in such an amazing cast of academics and practitioners to talk about this important topic. I also wanted to thank Elias Abagli, Sofia Bauduco, Gonzalo Garcia, and Alberto Unduraga for actually putting the details together here and keeping us on time and making sure everything's done. So thank you very, very much. Also wanted to thank my colleagues who traveled far, people who got up at 5 in the morning to discuss papers remotely for their participation. So one thing about being a keynote speaker, which I've only done this a few times, and I find this much more nerve-wracking than presenting a technical paper. So you get to take a step back and just think some big thoughts about an important topic. So one thing that I've learned during this conference already is it's really exciting that environmental economics has sort of infiltrated other fields of economics very slowly. So Steve Pulaski, who's always been one of my heroes, you know, we talk to the same sort of environmental people over and over, but all of a sudden, folks in finance, folks in macro, folks in behavioral are starting to think like, what does energy efficiency mean? What does climate regulation mean for our fields? And is there meaningful things we can add to the overall discussion? So seeing Philippe, my keynote is going to be deeply underwhelming compared to what the tour de force you got yesterday. Just hearing him say, you know, we've got to do things now, we've got to do multiple instruments, and you've got to focus about both mitigation and innovation separately. So hearing one of the leading growth economists in the world say that, it made me feel all warm and fuzzy, I have to say. So what I wanted to do today is I proposed a few topics. When I was in graduate school, my advisor always said, Max, you remind me of a puppy. You just get interested in so many different things. So I proposed 3 different topics, and the organizers chose the social cost of carbon, which I think is a really good moment to talk about this. Not to necessarily tell you what the number is. I'm going to tell you right now it's $190, so let's get that one out of the way. But I think what we learned from an exercise we just went through with regards to the social cost of carbon is an amazing story about collaboration between folks in academia, folks in public agencies, and folks in think tanks coming together to really construct a policy tool or measure that is going to be, I think, deeply influential more broadly. So it's a little bit of a storytelling exercise about what happened. Some of you in the room know the story quite well because you were parts of it. So I've added at the end some new ideas, hopefully, that'll help us think about what we could do going forward. So during the first dinner here, Jim Stock, Marshall Burke, and I, walked outside and had some dinner and started talking. And then Jim Stock came and said, "Where did 2 degrees come from? And was this would an economist recognize that 2-degree number?" Turns out the 2-degree number did come from an economist by the name of Bill Nordhaus in a 1975 paper. Bill sort of drew a line at 2 degrees and said this seems to be like a threshold that we probably shouldn't cross. But it's not necessarily motivated by what a resource economist thinks about sort of a time series of emissions with uncertainty about technologies and a finite sort of amount of carbon for given temperature targets that the atmosphere can absorb. So there's still work to be done there. I'm going to take 2 degrees as given for a second, as does the rest of the world, and just provide a little bit of context. So I made you a movie. This was one of my proudest achievements right here. So this is basically taking carbon budget seriously and saying if we want to get to 2 degrees, there's a fixed amount of carbon we can emit. If we would have started, let's do this one again, in 2001, the trajectory was still looked like a pretty steep trajectory of emissions reductions that's coming. But emissions have just been growing and growing and growing over time. And of course, what then happens is the sort of pathway to reduction, taking into account if we get unlimited, carbon sequestration and direct air capture that's free, then, this all looks different. But the notion here is this is a little bit like you've put on a lot of weight before the holidays, and the holidays are approaching closer and closer, and you can't get yourself to stop eating the cookies and the delicious drink. So the challenge becomes steeper and steeper and steeper until at some point you're just not going to meet your weight loss goal. This is, of course, much more serious. This is at the planetary scale, where what we're going to try and have to achieve here is pretty drastic decarbonization over the next 30 or so years. Now, what does this mean, right? We talk about the 2-degree goal. We could spend lots of time talking about how 2 degrees is defined. It's an annual average of average surface temperatures. But we're starting to cross that threshold. So this was one of the sort of more scary headlines in the news a couple of days ago, where globally we've crossed the 2-degree threshold for the first time for a couple of days there. So we're not permanently there, but we're certainly heading there. So I used to have a 1.5-degree target presentation in my presentations. I've taken that out because we are way past 1.5 degrees, and I think we should stop talking about it and try and make the 2 degrees if we can. Okay, so economists. When we talk to each other, we're all very happy and we like each other most of the time and we understand what each other is saying. When we leave the safe halls of academia and policy think tanks and central banks that are not just populated by economists, we're not loved quite as much outside. So one of the solutions that economists have been running around the world saying, if we're going to get out of this emissions problem, carbon pricing is clearly the first best, it's the only thing we should do. We should tax carbon, tax carbon, tax carbon. So where are we today? This is a different picture of the carbon tracker that I think Steve or somebody showed something similar right here. This is an optimistic picture of what carbon pricing looked like globally last year. Now, why is this optimistic? The way the World Bank shows you these pictures, if there's one subnational jurisdiction in your country that has priced carbon in some sort of way, your whole country is covered. Kansas does not have a price on carbon. California does. So the United States here counts as covered. What they do, though, which is quite fair, you can't really see that here. There's these little pies that are next to the individual continents right here. The colors tell you what share of emissions on each continent are covered by an actual carbon price right here. So for North America, it's 16%, Latin America and the Caribbean, 17%, Europe, it's more closer to 30%. If we're talking about East Asia and the Pacific, it's 35%, which has something to do with China's nascent carbon pricing systems right here. So one way you could look at this is if you're an optimist, you could declare victory and you could say, wow, this idea of sort of a Pigouvian tax that we teach in principles has really sort of spread across the world, and we're pricing one of the most important externalities just beautifully in large parts of the world and some of the major economies of the world. If you're not an optimist, if you're more sort of a Debbie or Donald Downer, you could say, look at the picture earlier, we're going to have to decarbonize rapidly. This ain't going to do it, right? We're going to have to do more than that. So I'm more on the Debbie Downer side, I have to say. I'm deeply concerned about us using carbon taxation as the only tool to meet this decarbonization challenge. What's even more worrisome, and this is going to become important when we talk about the social cost of carbon and what this means in the public sector and in the private sector separately here, is that just because it's priced doesn't necessarily mean it's very expensive, right? There are some parts of the world, so if you look at Uruguay and Liechtenstein and Switzerland and Sweden, which are not the world's largest economies right here, they have relatively ambitious carbon prices, $120, $130. Red here is a carbon tax. Blue is a cap and trade, a tradable permit system right here. Both, place a price on carbon. And that's sort of the puzzle that Jim Stock alluded to here, where he showed, two papers have differential effects. So there's different mechanisms here, but both are a price. But if you go down here, I'm not going to point at Chile down there, but I will. That price is relatively low. This is not a critique, right? But that's sort of what we're observing. So the key thing here, that's takeaway message number one to me, is what economists have failed at accomplishing is taking the political economy of this whole notion of carbon pricing fully seriously. So in political science, there's some folks doing really interesting work like Jonas Meckling and others that are thinking very carefully, not just about is a carbon tax the right thing, but what is the resistance to taxation and how do you think about actually making this a more broadly implemented policy tool. Before I switch over to the other price of carbon right here, I do want to say, and even though I'm German, I'm also going to obnoxiously focus on what's happening in the US because that's where I live every day and that's what my work focuses on. There's an interesting thing playing out in a couple of years when the Trump tax cuts are going to expire, which, there might be some interesting ideas floating around that both sides of the aisle could possibly support in this particular region here. So I'm not declaring carbon taxes have no future. I think there are opportunities, but we've certainly got to take the political side of this much more seriously. This is also evidenced by the fact, if you look at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden administration or the White House in general, there are way more sort of political folks walking around than folks with PhDs in economics in previous administrations. Really interesting people to talk to, but the density of economics has gone down quite a bit. Okay. So the first price of carbon, that's one that people actually pay, right? You pay it in your gasoline, you pay it in your heating fuels, whatever sector is covered. That's the thing we sort of teach in Intro to Economics. The second carbon price that, frankly, I hadn't really thought about very much until about 12, 13 years ago is this notion of the social cost of carbon. Economics has done many great things. The national income product accounts, I still think, are maybe the most important contribution. Economists, Kuznets, like counting how much stuff we make and consume is really important because without measuring things, it's very hard to pass good policy. The second coolest thing that I think economists have introduced into the policymaking process is the notion of benefits and costs, right? Before we make decisions, compare the benefits of a new rule to its costs. Obvious to everybody in this room that this is a good idea. If you disagree, I really must talk to you during coffee, all right? So one question that people have asked, we were relatively good at thinking about the costs of air pollution, for example, and other factors. But climate was a really tricky problem, right? What is the damage of 1 ton of CO2 emitted today over the next 300 years across all sectors of the economy globally? This is a room full of central bankers forecasting something 280 years into the future gives you nightmares, right? The struggle is like 3/4 out already poses a challenge. So we're doing something really far out, and we're doing it not just for one possibly relatively closed economy, but we're doing it for the globe where, think about agriculture, energy, all kinds of sectors are going to be affected by this. So this, what I'm going to say here, is a difficult number to calculate, and are we ever going to get it exactly right? The answer is definitely no. But the question is, can you calculate a number that's good enough, that's credible, that will actually withstand sort of political scrutiny and peer review as a number that measures these damages globally? Okay, so I usually don't have pictures of Ronald Reagan in my presentations. It's not something I do, but this is an Avedon portrait that I actually really like. So the social cost of carbon, that's what SCC stands for the rest of this talk. Ronald Reagan is a hero of the Republican Party and my more conservative friends. He was also a movie actor, so now people are talking about maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger could be next. He was not born in the United States, so you can't be president. But Ronald Reagan mandated the use of benefit cost analyses if agencies want to pass new rules and regulations. So it wasn't an optional thing. It would be nice if you conducted benefit cost analysis. You have to do it. There are rules written around how you do it, and that to me is one of the big contributions in the early 1980s policymaking process. I was 8 years old at the time, so didn't realize this was happening, but I'm very glad it did. Now, where does this become spicy in the climate reign? So the Department of Transportation, which does things like regulate fuel economy, you know, do you get to drive a 8-cylinder Ford on average down the street, or should we, you know, think about having smaller, more efficient engines right here, tried to pass a rule that placed $0 on the benefits of avoided greenhouse gases, right? So, you know, basically the atmosphere is a free trash can that you get to use as much as you want. The Court of Appeals, which is the US legal system is still sort of a mystery to me, but the Court of Appeals said, we don't know what the number is, but we know it's not zero, right? There is some damage that CO2 is going to cause, so figure it out. Now, in 2009, President Obama came in. At the time, there were lots of environmental economists in the administration. So Michael Greenstone at the University of Chicago, who has the Milton Friedman Chair in economics. I really like the fact that the Milton Friedman Chair is held by an environmental economist. And I think Cass Sunstein sort of pushed this along. So there was a process where agencies across the administrations, was more than a dozen agencies, came together and said, we're going to figure out one number that we're going to use in all cost benefit or benefit cost analysis across the government. So this group was called the Interagency Working Group. It had names that, you know, environmental economists would recognize within the agencies working on this, and they issued a social cost of carbon. At the time, it was something like $40. It was actually $42. If you've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it was lower. The revised version was 42. I always say Jim's shaking his head. No, Max, it wasn't 42. Final number was 42, which is also, if you've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the most important number in all of the universe. But maybe that joke goes flat here. So the notion is they came out with a number, and what they did pretty immediately is they asked for peer review of that number, which is the first step to me of what made this really powerful. In the United States, there's the national academies. Government can go to the national academies and say, we would like you to review what we did and tell us what we did well, and tell us what we didn't do well and how to fix it. So Ken Gillingham, who was working in the White House at the time, came to the national academies to a panel, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, and basically issued a charge saying, review what we did and tell us honestly, independently. This is not a justification or providing backing for a number. We could have said, this is terrible, you shouldn't use it. We didn't. And review this. So in late 2016, we issued a report. It's a beautiful report, I have to say. And then President Trump was elected and basically took that report, put it in the trash can, could not do away with the social cost of carbon because it's a number that was mandated, but did some really tricky things, which I'll show you in a second, changed the discount rate and turned it from a global into a domestic number, which essentially turned the social cost of carbon somewhere between $1 and $6 a ton, making it not very meaningful in most analysis. One of the first acts President Biden did after getting elected is reconvene the interagency working group, put the people back together, and said, let's update the social cost of carbon and address all the challenges by the national academies. So that's the story I'm going to tell you for the next sort of 10 minutes or so, which I think is just a beautiful story and one of the most fun periods in my life, I have to say. I like weird things. But the social cost of carbon, some people say it's not that important. It's used in benefit cost analyses just in the US alone in close to 100 regulations now with roughly $1 trillion in total benefits. So while nobody directly pays it, right, it prevents bad policy from being passed, right? And it also helps good policy make it across the hurdle for the right reasons in some settings. And we can talk about, you know, how big it has to be to do that if you want. Okay, so here's a terrible graph. So I'm warming up the room for Tamara Carlton and Marshall Burke, who are masters at visualizing data. But if you go from the bottom to the top here, that's how time increases. On the y-axis, you have a number of different rulings of how the federal government actually used the social cost of carbon in the past, starting with the 2008 NHTSA rule. And then, we go from Bush 2 to Obama to Trump and now to Biden. If you're looking at the top row here, the 2023 EPA, the new social cost of carbon that was just peer-reviewed and is out of peer review now, is just simply much, much higher than what we had before. Now, I'll tell you a little bit why that is and where to go from here. But I think that the stark thing you should look at is the 2018 EPA number that essentially took that number to 0. And after adopting what we did here, again, the global number with the new discount rates, the number really did change. Okay, so quick reminder. So I don't know if Jim Stock is right or not. Jim Stock is usually right, but very rarely he's not. So the question is it time to declare victory on the social cost of carbon after this exercise and move on to other stuff? I'm in favor of both. I think some people should certainly continue working on adding sectors to the social cost of carbon and making it better. Is it the only thing that climate economists should be working on? The answer is definitely not, right? So why does the social cost of carbon matter? What you've got here in the green line on the left, if you have a $51 social cost of carbon, which is bringing the $42 number into $2020 right here, some things like clean power plan, reforestation, maybe direct air capture doesn't make it yet, but you see a number of policies that under $51 actually make it, but a number are still to the right. So this is obviously not surprising to anybody in this room, but a higher social cost of carbon, if it's the right number, right, brings more technologies into a positive benefit cost ratio right here. So the new number is, just if you're thinking about scale here, somewhere around $190 right now. Low carbon fuel standards, we can talk about this for a while. I am not a fan. Okay, so how do you calculate the social cost of carbon? It's a modeling exercise, right? There's no way it has econometric components, but it is an integrated assessment model. It's super simplified. And every economist that's ever looked at has their favorite critique of what's not, done here. Maybe it doesn't have the right geographic resolution and so on. But let me talk about what this actually does. So the first thing you need is a set of socioeconomic projections. So you need projections of population growth by region, not out to 2100, but you actually need it out to 2300. So really long-range forecasts of population and income, right? How wealthy people are, and I'll get back to Elias's point from yesterday right here, in the future really depends on how well they can adapt to climate change, and also tells you how much built-up stuff and valuable stuff is in the way of natural disasters possibly driven by climate change. So income really matters for both adaptation, but also on the damages side, right here. Then you combine population and income, and you turn it into an emissions trajectory. So rich and highly populated gives you a different CO2 profile than poor and lower populations. Then you take that emissions trajectory, you feed it into a climate model, and it tells you a time series of surface temperatures and sea level rise and whatever else comes out of your climate model. That's the top right thing. And then you do, and that's what Tama and Marshall, I think, are going to spend some time about, translating temperature and sea level rise into economic damages. So you need a dose response function like we have them in public health. If I give you an aspirin, will you have less headache? Only here is, if I make it warmer, will you have more electricity consumption and more mortality? So that's where a lot of the economics comes in, is estimating these dose response functions, translating temperature into damages. I'm also going to note that 98% of all public funding for climate change has gone into basically the top right panel right here. So 98%, billions and billions of dollars have been spent understanding the climate system. Very little money has actually gone into translating how the changes in the climate system actually affect humans and animals and land. So not asking for money, but just noting that maybe in terms of priorities, it'd be really good to switch towards the social impact side while continuing to study the climate system. So what's the social cost of carbon? Okay, we've translated wealth and population into emissions, emissions into temperature and sea level rise into damages. Then what you do is you go back and you add 1 ton of carbon to the atmosphere at one point in time, and you trace out how that changes temperature, sea level rise, how that changes damages, and then you take the wedge between the damages without the ton and the damages with the ton, and you get a time series of damages because CO2 lives for 1,000 years or so, and you discount it into the present, and that discounted present value is the social cost of carbon. Why is this so hard? It's the fact that it's a stock pollutant and it has global effects across so many sectors. Okay, so that's what it is. The number, the interim number, and the one we're currently still using is 51 US dollars per ton, but it is, we're on the verge of seeing an update here. So I promised I would talk about collaboration between academics and policymakers, so this National Academies report was just a wonderful exercise. Most people in this room above the age of 35 have probably been asked to do one if you're in the United States. So Maureen Cropper and Richard Newell, who are 2 very famous environmental economists, chaired it. There were climate scientists on there. There were people who do uncertainty. There were people who are doing expert elicitation. There were people who do demography kind of stuff on there, and a bunch of economists. And we came out with a recommendation basically saying, instead of the Excel spreadsheet that most people use to model the social cost of carbon, right? DICE lived in both a spreadsheet and some computation, but most of the other models were just Excel spreadsheets. Can you sort of break this out modularly, have people who understand something about GDP forecasts do those, have demographers who understand something about population do those, then have the climate folks build a climate model that actually reflects how the physical system worked. The previous version was a climate model that was peer-reviewed mostly by economists. Economists should not peer-review climate science. So you basically have this lovely modular structure where individual communities can work on improving these individual modules that then fit together sort of like a Lego toolkit to come up with that number. The big advance here, to me, everybody has their favorite aspect here, was to really think very carefully about uncertainty in the social cost of carbon and how that uncertainty propagates from the beginning, from the socioeconomics, through to temperature, through to parametric uncertainty in some of these models right here, to really get a full characterization of the uncertainty around the number. And they did an amazing job on that. The other bits right here that we proposed, and this is, I think, a reasonable thing to talk about in this audience, is if you're going to use an econometric model to forecast 300 years out of sample, you're going to get crazy predictions. So there were 2 things made here that I'll talk about a little bit more, but a really clever combination of both statistical methods and expert elicitation, where experts sort of looked at forecasts and said, this isn't reasonable, we should rule these ones out right here. We're going to talk about damage calculations in a second. That to me was the other big thing. A lot of the damage functions in the old sort of climate models came from the time when Richard Toll wrote his dissertation in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We've done a lot of understanding of what temperature and sea level rise do to human well-being, so updating these damage functions is key, and I'll punt a lot of this to Tama and Marshall. Discounting was another thing. Instead of using sort of fixed rate discounting here, use discounting approaches that actually reflect the rate of economic growth in the underlying damage projection right here. So let me just quickly go through this and then close with something that's a little more entertaining, because we're just before lunch right here. It really took a village to get this done. Why? Right? So if the National Academies comes back usually and says you want to improve this, the EPA goes ahead and hires a bunch of consultants and does a bunch of stuff themselves and updates the number right here. But under Trump, there was no interagency working group. So two groups, basically one at Resources for the Future that Jim did a lot of work with and I was a little bit involved with, and another group at the Climate Impact Lab at the University of Chicago, basically held the torch and implemented all of the recommendations by the National Academies during the Trump administration. So there were 4 years there where people outside of federal government updated the number. When Biden got elected, on the right here you have 4 of the most important environmental economists in North America. These are my friends at the Environmental Protection Agency right here. The EPA could just pick up that work from those 2 modeling groups and implement it relatively quickly. So we did not lose 4 years, but we generated real science in those 4 years. So let me quickly just show you what this looks like, right? So this is your what an IAM looks like these days. Same thing as we had before, but now in box form. What was really cool about population projections is we've heard a lot about the SSPs, right? There's 4 or 5 of them. I always describe them, and this sounds really disrespectful, but when I give my kid a crayon and I ask him to draw a line, there's a line, right? It comes with a story, much like my kid's line is going to come with a story. The stories are different for the 4 different lines. It doesn't come with a probability, right? I can't tell you how likely any of these are, and I just don't know what to do with them, right? So what I really like about the new work that comes out here is they spoke to people who do population projections and thought about what does a full distribution of population in different regions look like over the next 300 years to fully characterize the distribution of population projections. Much like when we think of these beautiful money supply forecasts that central banks issue, where you folks did these nice sort of waterfall things for many, many years. So the gray shaded area here is not 4 crayons, but the black line here shows you, I think, the median of the population projections, but the gray fan right here fully characterizes the uncertainty around that. They did something very similar for GDP growth, and this is, maybe we can come back to that in the discussion a little bit. So Jim Stock, Mark Watson, and Ulrich Müller have this nice paper, How to Do Sort of Long-Run Forecasting. And I'm not going to do it justice here. If you have any questions or criticisms of this, he's sitting right there. But the basic notion here is forecast per capita growth rates of GDP instead of trying to forecast levels of GDP out here. So again, what you're getting, you have your crayon lines, the SSPs. But what this project did is it showed you a full distribution of what GDP growth rates, I do believe, by region look like for the next 300 years. The noteworthy thing here to me is we're still predicting sort of a perpetual sort of 1.7% growth out 300 years, which leads us back to what you sort of pointed at yesterday. The level of wealth predicted by that a couple of hundred years out is absolutely massive. And the question is, how does that, which ones of these are enabled by different types of climate scenarios here? So I think that's a question I struggle with. Emissions projections. I love this picture because that's where the kid got really excited with the crayons, right? So the SSPs have some really high emissions, some really low emissions. But again, here you combine the population and the GDP projections, and you get the full distribution of emissions going forward. So really beautifully done on the socioeconomic and emissions pathways. This is going to seem super boring, but I swear it's not. The old climate model in the existing social cost of carbon models, IAMs, was not good as an understatement, right? So most climate scientists, when they saw that, said, okay, we can do better. So there's now a very simple climate model in there. I believe it's called FAIR, that actually is consistent with physical principles of the climate system and how we think sort of emissions propagate into temperature. So we can translate in a consistent way temperature changes, but what I want to point out here is the uncertainty traces through the model now, right? I take one scenario, I draw a scenario of population growth and GDP. I can trace that out, what that does to temperature, and then I take the same assumptions and I feed it into my damage model. So it's internally perfectly consistent, and then it's just a question of computational power. So climate model is sort of boring, but really important. Where it gets really exciting is with damage functions. So the current model, when you listen to people say, what kind of damage function would you like in a best case scenario? It should be global. It should have long run adaptation. How is my great-great-great-great-grandchild going to air condition with what technology in the year 2250? I have no idea, right? Try and put yourself 200 years ago, 1823, and try and predict what today looks like. That's very similar to what we're trying to do here. It should be causal, right, because causal inference is important, should be valid over that 3-century period right here, should of course account for extreme events and nonlinearities, and should be spatially and hopefully also, you know, sort of socio-demographically heterogeneous. So what we've got in the current model now is we've got mortality, energy, agricultural impacts, coastal damages, and labor productivity. That's currently in there. There's going to be more sectors, and I'll complain about which ones are missing. Ones we lost in the process from previous models were forests, water, vector-borne diseases. How do mosquitoes all of a sudden migrate, and where does malaria come from? Even though there's really exciting news about a malaria vaccine, so that whole thing might change quite a bit. And big storms aren't in there either. And we have nothing on species loss. I'm looking at Steve and Justin right here. That's your job, and habitats. Migration, air pollution, crime, and conflict, right? So we're limited to really 4 to 5 sectors in the current number right here. Everything else is not in there. Discounting. One of the most important things that didn't just happen here, but that also happened in the US more broadly, there's something called the circular A4 that tells you lots and lots of detail about how you're supposed to do benefit cost analysis and how governments discount certain values right here. That's just been updated for the first time in forever. So I highly encourage anyone interested in these types of topics reading it. It's a really great accessible tool that lays out some of the most recent literature right here. But they really changed discounting. So Billy Pizer and Richard Newell were sort of really at the helm here saying, you know, the rates should be consistent with policy rates, so somewhere between 2 to 3%. There was a really nice expert elicitation by Moritz Strupp and a bunch of others in the AHA policy that sort of said, you know, most experts think a 2% rate is roughly the right way to go, but it should certainly take into account economic growth in the way we teach in graduate school right here. So what they did here is they took this, and there's a paper that's been hotly discussed, but how to actually calibrate parameters for these discounting modules to match near-term rates. Where you then have to really think about what long-run behavior of interest rates is. So there's some nitty-gritty stuff here about interest rates that's actually really important in the social cost of carbon that folks that do macro have things to say about. Okay, so the question I want to ask, I only have like 6 more minutes right here. Did the number change? Yes, it changed a lot, right? So the interim values, that's the old models, are on the left. So that's the distribution, because you run these sort of 50,000 times and you show a distribution of the social cost of carbon and then report the mean or the median, depending on who you are. On the right-hand side is the distribution of the proposed values. So the thing to note is everything changed. The scenarios, the climate model, the damage functions, the discounting. So there was a lot of snark out in the literature saying, oh, you just changed the discount rate. I could have done that. You could have saved yourself all the work, right? So you're seeing in the old times it was 2.5, 3, and 5%. The new values are 1.5, 2, and 2.5%. So is it just the discount rate? We're overlapping at 2.5% for both of these. If you compare them, for the 2.5% discounting the old values and the new values, the distributions are fundamentally different right here. So it's not just the discount rate. It's the approach to discounting. It is all of these other good things that I've talked about a second ago. So science here really made a difference in a policy-relevant parameter that is really important. Now, one discussion I keep on having, and this is something that I don't think there is full agreement here across the economics profession right here. What I'm showing you currently are the damages to the entire world. Why should the United States care about what happened to Chileans? Why should Chileans care about what happens in the United States? Shouldn't you just count damages here in the Andes and on your land and so on and ignore what happens elsewhere? So there's been a push by a group of people to say maybe the domestic number is the right number, which of course is a fraction of the global number right here. I'm going to use this soapbox and just say the domestic number is the wrong number to use from economic first principles right here. If you want to get to the optimal emissions level and benefit cost analysis, you have to use the global number. Because if everybody compares their number to their domestic number, you're not going to sufficiently invest in mitigation or pass the wrong rules. The question then is, well, Max, you don't like it, right? But could we calculate that number? Well, you could write one down or estimate, right? But the thing I keep on saying is the social cost of carbon on Americans, for example, is not just physically in the United States. There's 9 million Americans living abroad, some serving in uniform in other places, others just working elsewhere. So if you're just using the domestic one, you're ignoring all American citizens elsewhere. You're also ignoring the security risk to individual countries from climate-driven conflict elsewhere. And you are completely not getting effects on international trade and sort of general equilibrium effects, which frankly aren't fully in these models yet anyway, so that's really a cheap shot. Okay, one other point, and then I actually want to skip my usual whining and just tell you something about windmills for a second, about other things that are interesting. But there's this concept of equity weighting, right? So the notion here is pretty simple. A given consumption loss, if I lose $1, I'm a well-paid economist at a fancy university, if I lose $1, it doesn't hurt as much as if somebody else who makes $5, $6 a day loses that same dollar, right? So there's a bigger loss in well-being to a poor person from an equivalent consumption loss than to a rich person. There's an approach called equity weighting, which goes way back. It never really made the mainstream right here, but it recognizes this and just simply assigns a higher weight to climate damages occurring to low-income regions. So this is not necessarily just equity within a room here, but this is just recognizing that different countries have different levels of wealth here. And this is not some Berkeley hippie kind of approach right here. This is consistent with standard economic theory, but it's a different way of calculating the social cost of carbon. Now, is this something that Max just talks to his students and friends about and nobody cares? The Bundesumweltamt, which is the German Environmental Protection Agency, actually uses an equity-weighted social cost of carbon because they think it's the right number to use. Does it make a difference? Makes a massive difference. So David Anthoff is working on a paper to do this for CO2, and the numbers, I assume, are going to be much bigger. Okay. Can I use 4 more minutes to talk about something that came up over dinner? Okay, I'm going to skip a bunch of, oh, sorry, before we get to this one, was going to complain about missing sectors, but you know what they are. One thing I'm just going to say, open source computation, like Justin said yesterday, is clearly the future here. There used to be this attitude that individual economists had their little consulting shops with their little model, and they were hired by people around the world and made a huge amount of money doing this. But it prevents progress and it prevents good science. What David Anthoff and Fran Moore and others did, they put these models, the official EPA models, into something called the MIMI project. You can download it all. If you can write in Julia, which is a really fast computational language, if you can write in Python, you can write in Julia. You can run these models really easily, really quickly. You can modify them any way you want. So simply putting these into the light has made a huge amount of difference. Okay, so one thing I quickly wanted to conclude here and then talk about windmills for a moment. the social cost of carbon is clearly important, but I think where that number, whether governments use it or not is of course up to individual countries. Not each country needs to calculate its own. Once we've calculated this number once, everybody else can go ahead and use it. So that's a nice sort of public goods characteristic here. But somebody yesterday brought up this notion, like, what's the role of the corporate sector here in emissions control right here? So large corporations adopting internal carbon prices or imposing an internal social cost of carbon. Amazon, for example, has committed to being, net zero by some year. And they've taken this really seriously and started thinking about how do we incorporate a carbon price internally from soup to nuts, right? From the time you manufacture the thing until it arrives in the big bubble wrap box at your door. So the social cost of carbon also gives folks just a guide as to how high that number could be. There's subtle differences along optimal policy path versus not, but we can talk about that over lunch. Okay, something came up over lunch or dinner yesterday that is my favorite project that we just finished. It's coming out in a nice journal in a couple of weeks. Chile is at the frontier of building massive amounts of renewable energy infrastructure. There's wind in the south, there's solar in the north, and one of the big things, the costs of the renewable energy transition that keep on being used against the cost of the renewable energy transition. So this is my link from the social cost of carbon to another cost. There's this story that we hate the view of windmills, right? So Johannes, I think, mentioned that this morning, that people really don't like the visuals of windmills in their front yard and it's damaging people's well-being. So I asked the same question 10 years ago and just couldn't figure out how to do it. So if Sophia and I live next door to each other and I can see a windmill from my house and she doesn't see the same windmill, I can compare the value of my house to her house, accounting for, number of bedrooms and size of yard and so on. And if I did this for all the homes in the United States, figure out what the visual disamenity from a windmill is. So what we did here is windmills don't kill birds. They do kill a couple of birds, by the way, but house cats kill 2.4 billion birds a year. Windmills, $234,000. So lock up your cat, don't protest against windmills is the, sorry, you want a picture? I'll send it to you, a high resolution. And this comes from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. This is not some, no, there's a real externality to having house cats. Windmills are huge, right? So what we did is, are solar and wind farms ugly or beautiful? I think they're really beautiful. They remind me of watching Star Wars. Other people think they're really ugly. So I wanted to know, on average, do people value these or not? So what we did, using a crazy amount of computational power for the entire United States, calculated which homes can actually see a windmill and which homes can't. So you need to calculate, there's windmills everywhere. There's houses everywhere. So pink here is windmills. Blue is housing values. And then we have a high-resolution surface of the United States. We know where every windmill is, how tall it is. We know where all the houses are and how much they sell for. So I can show you which houses. The pink one over there cannot see the windmill, but its two orange neighbors can see the windmill on the hill. We do this for all housing transactions in the United States over the past 25 years and wanted to figure out, do people dislike having windmills next door? The answer is, if you live right next to a windmill, yes, you don't really enjoy it. So you have to, but you have to really have the windmill like a half a mile to a mile from you, consistent with roughly a 5% drop in property values. That value diminishes and is essentially indistinguishable from zero at about 6 miles or 10 kilometers out. At that distance, if you held an aspirin tablet in your hand about an arm's width apart, that's how big the windmill, average windmill appears right now. So the further away you are in space, the less you care. The average number we came up with, it's about a 1% drop. Oh, sorry, I'll stand right here. Thank you, that's very kind of you, but this I'll just reposition, different type of adaptation. So we looked at, the average number is about a 1% drop in home values, but the interesting stuff here is we show that low-income folks mind this view much less than rich people, and Republicans really hate windmills much more than Democrats do, and more windmills is worse than fewer windmills. Maybe the most important finding, and I swear I'm almost done right here, is if we look at a time trend in that treatment effect over the 30-year period that we look at, that effect diminishes towards the end of the sample. So the first windmills, when we didn't know what they were, people were like, oh, that's really ugly. Now they put them up, and we're just like, it's like transmission infrastructure. You don't even see it's there anymore. It's just part of the landscape, right? So it seems that over time we've gotten used to these windmills, and that effect has gone to almost zero, okay? So what I want to conclude with is, and I'm sorry I hijacked the last 3 minutes here with a just really tangentially related project right there, but I'm really interested in not just the social cost of carbon, right? How much damage do emissions do by 1 ton, but thinking about how do we estimate the costs of the underlying energy transition going forward that enables us to meet the carbon challenge right here. So I think, you know, folks should continue working on the social cost of carbon, but I want us to think much, much more broadly. I was really excited by this habitat work yesterday, looking at the macro work. We're going to hear about migration later today. So I think our toolkit and how we look at the world is uniquely suited to help answer some of these big questions that stand in the way of you know, coming even close to that trajectory I showed in the beginning. So thank you very much, and that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Professor Auffhammer, for a very compelling and interesting talk. Yeah, Elias.
Thanks, Max, for that great presentation and the evidence you provide for pet control in my house, which I hope it will be effective. I have a question about what exactly enters the new work that's being done on the social cost of carbon, in particular related to something we touched upon briefly yesterday, related to tipping points. So there was a paper presented that had some simple functional forms that had tipping points in it, which I thought it was the right conceptual approach, which is not present in most models. I'm just guessing it's not present in the computational social cost of carbon. And I'm not sure why. I mean, there seems to be a well-populated, relevant literature on tipping points. We are not sure about their probability. We are not sure about their costs. But the recent work is basically telling us that tipping points are closer and they're more likely than we thought they were. So if you take a simple model and you add, the probability of switching to another equilibrium, we put basically a Lagrangian multiplier to that, right? That will increase the social cost of carbon, I'm guessing, significantly, because every half a degree Celsius, puts us a lot closer to hitting some of those tipping points. So there's a lot of uncertainty on the tipping point themselves, but there's a lot of uncertainty in everything that's related to this. So it's not a good reason to exclude them. And my prior is that this is like a big quantitative change if you include it in the calculation. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
So I think that's a... Got it. I think it's a great question. When we say tipping points, you always want to worry, are we talking about climate tipping points, or are we talking about sort of on the damage side? So the old models page, I think, had extreme events in there, right? So there were some sort of tail events that were modeled right here. I wasn't quite sure, what they were. It was like a category of extreme events. So I'm not sure the sort of nonlinearities and what's in the FAIR model on the climate side. I know on the damages side, if you look at the mortality functions on all of those are highly nonlinear. But I think if I were to answer your question, the beauty of this now is if you think there's something missing, you're the Mimi project away from actually adding it and seeing whether it makes a difference right there, right? So I think what we've currently got in the light under the EPA numbers are things that pass, strict peer review, sort of best sort of scientific standards right here. But to get order of magnitudes of some of these things out and see whether they should be added, I think you could do it, and there's certainly teams working on that. But Bob Pindyke has been sort of saying that for many years, very, very loudly, saying all this social cost of carbon, marginal impact stuff is not the stuff we should be looking at. We should be looking at the big disasters. That's where the costs come from, even if they're low probability events. But putting numbers on that is hard. He's got a paper where there's some numbers in there, but they're certainly, I don't think they're in the current models.
This is a great overview, and we keep our cats indoors. I want to underscore a point that you made. This is a little bit more of a comment than a question, although I'll try to make it a question. I want to underscore a point that you made, which is that this has really been a team project by a large group of economists over many generations to accomplish this. When I was in the when I was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors in 2013, it fell on my shoulders to take us into the 2013-2014 release, and which is where we got the $51 number, traces to that revision. And it was, in hindsight, just remarkable how much, that was 10 years ago, how much resistance there was internally. The political, we had a lot of trouble actually getting that release and getting it over the political hurdle of doing it. We actually ended up doing the release on the Friday before Memorial Day weekend. And the only reason that it actually got out is that the president overruled his political advisors and wanted to see it happen. But this is just, there's so many people who have been involved with this over many years, and it's really a huge triumph. I guess the one thing that might be a little bit more of a question is going back to my assertion that this is just a fantastic line of work. There's a ton of open questions. We can still think of many ways that this could be improved. But if you go back to the abatement cost figure that you had, this updated one from Larson et al. 2022, most of those are well below and I think you made this point, they're well below the 190, 180 range. The ones that are above have, clear, they would fail just any old cost effectiveness test. LCFS is just a mess of a policy compared to many alternatives that will be decarbonizing much more effectively, efficiently, and more rapidly than an LCFS within the transportation sector. So this is, I think I'm just repeating myself here with this assertion that, while this is really interesting and we could all pursue these interesting intellectual questions further, that might not be the highest and best use. But it's a good example of how we as economists have already teamed up and worked on different aspects to really make a really important contribution, but now there's new contributions to make.
So I agree with all of that. The one thing where I still think there's interesting economics to be done, other than just estimating more damage functions, is the sort of general equilibrium stuff that some of these trade models are now trying to incorporate to see how that affects the overall number. Because right now there's, what happens in one region doesn't really affect another, and that's clearly not how that's going to work. So, I'm always thinking about, is it policy relevant and can I publish it in a really good journal? At the same time, that stuff I think is clearly there's a huge upside, and we saw some examples of these models in this conference. But I'm with you. There's other stuff that's much more pressing than all of us working on more damage functions. Some people still should.
Yeah.
Yeah, super quickly. So thanks for great talk. So a couple of just reflections and maybe a suggestion as well. So there's also comparable data on house value increases relative to those that have put photovoltaics on them. And that's changed over time, and so that would be another data set, I think, to really look at in the United States and maybe beyond the United States as well, because now you've got distributed PV in gigawatt scale in Brazil and elsewhere as well, going on. And then also a counter data set might be interesting. My gut tells me it's a counter data set in the UK, where the value proposition to a homeowner for a wind turbine actually is beyond the value of the house, but it's actually the cost of the energy provided by a given company. That is not in the calculation in the United States, I believe. It's a purely separated distinction between, I'll call it, the visual impact and the value of the house. And so there may be a subtlety there that changes the value proposition and I'll call it the consumer value, depending upon what I'll call it the offer is. And so PV has a different offer, wind in the UK has a different offer in the US as well. So potentially, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the PV system economic value proposition relative to wind or not, if you've studied that data. So thanks.
So the only thing I'm going to say there is the windmill doesn't do anything to my house. I put up PV when I put on a new roof, and we painted our front door, and we put in a new kitchen. So if the causal inference police comes after you, it's much harder to break that with a solar PV system, which is a private decision, versus the windmill. The only private decision is, do I stand outside with a sign yelling, "I don't want any windmills in my view shed." But Ken Gillingham has asked some of these questions really nicely, and I think Stephen Jarvis at LSE is doing some work along those lines in the UK. So it's a hard but really interesting question.
One last question.
Yes, thank you so much for this great presentation. I want to double down and emphasize something that you noted near the end about the importance of open science and open source code. And I'll give you a very brief story. Is we had a student come through who wanted to run dice, and he used the Excel spreadsheet, and then he used the hard-to-use GAMS code, but I pointed him to the Mimi Julia page, and this has been greatly effective at accelerating his work. And so I would just list this as an example of something that would have taken, which was a master's student more or less all of his time to get his head around this, is becoming something that is both a better and more replicable program, but also just much faster at getting new researchers up to speed. And so I just want to compliment, the efforts there with the Mimi project and all the other related things, and to say that I really think this is the way to go, and that this will have direct benefits for some of the research that I presented the previous day, because it's sort of obvious how you can take then these models, and we didn't have a climate model in our ecosystem services model, but it's sort of an obvious next step, and that's what we have this student doing. So I wanted to just comment on that particular point.
I'll close with one cute anecdote. I was giving a talk at some conference at MIT, and I put the Mimi thing up. And then some guy asked a question that I didn't know the answer to, and 20 minutes later, same guy raises his hand and says, "Oh, I just downloaded Mimi. I did this. I added this little module thing, and I changed it, and the answer is 4, just so you know." So it's, there's a combination of MIT students and the software, but it is, I agree, just absolutely the way to go.